Consequently, I have assumed that it has none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. The philosopher who finds no meaning in this world is not concerned exclusively with the problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do, or why his friends should not seize political power and govern in the way that they find most advantageous to themselves. For myself personally, listen now please, writing in 1946 as Huxley, for myself personally, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation, sexual and political. To assume that this world had no meaning freed me from any moorings of any kind. I wanted this world not to have meaning. Can a person like that be totally objective, totally transcending on pronouncements of ultimate reality? Listen, for example, to this statement that is given to us by Richard Lewontin, who's a geneticist. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories. But David Berlinski comes out with this question: why should any discerning man or woman take the side of science or anything else under these circumstances? Richard Lewontin goes on to say why he doesn't want anything outside of science. Here's his answer: because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. He doesn't want a divine foot in the door. Berlinski responds by saying this: if one is obliged to accept absurdities for fear of a divine foot, imagine what prodigies of effort would be required were the rest of the divine torso to be found wedged at the door with some justifiable irritation demanding to be let in. Berlinski is a secular thinker. So every time he's hitting against the atheists, he's hitting against the naturalistic worldview. He says, what? Lewontin is telling me that he would believe in the absurd because he doesn't want a divine foot in the door. He said, what is Lewontin going to do if the divine torso itself is wedged, forcing itself in, demanding an explanation? So David Berlinski, in his book, The Devil's Delusion, in the jacket cover, and by the way, he's had personal contact with John Lennox. His book, The Devil's Delusion, is worth buying. Read it again and again, except for the last chapter, which I have some difficulties with in his comparison with written revelation and the book of nature. The rest of the book is a scathing critique of the pretensions of this atheism. In the jacket cover, he says this: has anyone provided a proof of God's inexistence? Not even close. Has quantum cosmology explained the emergence of the universe or why it is here? Not even close. Have the sciences explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life? Not even close. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything so long as it is not religious thought? Close enough. Has rationalism and moral thought provided us with an understanding of what is good, what is right, and what is moral? Not close enough. Has secularism in the terrible 20th century been a force for good? Not even close to being close. Is there a narrow and oppressive orthodoxy of thought and opinion within the sciences? Close enough. Does anything in the sciences or in their philosophy justify the claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even in the ballpark. Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on.
Hi, I'm Ravi Zacharias, the director of Wellspring International. I'd like to take a minute and talk about Wellspring, which is the humanitarian arm of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. The vision of Wellspring is to identify and financially equip existing organizations aiding women and children at risk. Additionally, we work to provide individual scholarships to support education, healthcare, and basic living needs. We would love to hear from you, and we welcome your support. 100% of every gift designated for Wellspring goes directly to a project on the ground. Please call us at 770-449-6766 or email us at wellspring@rzim.org. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about Wellspring International. And now let's get back to today's teaching with Ravi Zacharias.
So you've got the total transcendent objective way of looking at it. The second one is total determinism. Total determinism runs something like this. It is the idea that we are so locked into our DNA, so locked into our biochemical makeup, that whatever we do, whatever we think, whatever we reason is that locked in, pre-programmed, predetermined reaction to the hard wiring and the soft wiring that we have. Like a computer. If you press this button, that will emerge. If you press a combination of these buttons, that's the way it will be. I remember when I was doing some courses at Cambridge University, listening to Stephen Hawking speak. And Stephen Hawking was going to give a talk on is humanity determined or free. The auditorium was jammed. As you know, Hawking has suffered from Lou Gehrig's disease, is not able to speak, and therefore a Caltech scientist has made for him a fantastic computer that takes the letters that he puts in, forms the words, collates them into sentences, and then synthetically produces a voice on the basis of which he speaks. So he prepares his talk long before. There are two ways in which he controls it, either by a 1 centimeter move of his index finger, which controls an infrared ray, or if that stops working, by the batting of an eyelid. This brilliant scientist is able to somehow communicate and speak to the audiences. His whole talk was on this: is humanity determined or free? He said there was no escape from the fact that determinism was the inexorable flow of naturalistic assumptions. There's no way to break away from this hardwiring. But listen now to how Berlinski responds to one of the scientists who did this study. After comparing listen very carefully to this quote, please. After comparing more than 2,000 DNA samples, an American molecular geneticist, Dean Hamer, concluded that a person's capacity to believe in God is linked to his brain chemicals. And he goes on to say, we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity. But listen now, it is because he is hardwired by his brain chemicals. Perhaps it will not be amiss, says Berlinski, that Dr. Hamer has made the same claim about homosexuality. And if he is refrained from arguing that a person's capacity to believe in molecular genetics is linked to a brain chemical, it is no doubt owing to the prudent sense that once that door is open, God alone knows how and when anyone will be able to slam it shut again. See what he's saying? That a person's belief in God is sort of ultimately produced by some kind of chemicals in the brain. He's wired and the chemistry produces that. He went on to say that that's how homosexuality is ultimately produced. And Berlinski rightly raises the question, if all of our behavior and all of our thinking is so chemically engendered, what about the belief itself that it is all chemically engendered is not produced by some chemistry? You follow what I'm saying? This deterministic locked in. If everything is the product of that hardwiring, why is the thought itself not a product of hardwiring and therefore neither true nor false? And so as we move from total objectivity to total determinism, we come to the third option, which is semi-transcendence. This is the way I see it. Humanity is able to move outside of itself to a legitimate degree, and what it ends up doing really in the ability to move out of itself to a legitimate degree is able to then measure its pronouncements by external testing, by external verification for correspondence and coherence. When you make a statement, you can check it out correspondingly to be true. When you build a system, you can look at it as a systemically coherent worldview. This is the way it is in our courts of law. This ought to be the way it is in a scientific lab itself. When you make a statement, it's measured against the referent. When you put together a system, it ought to be coherent and brought together. Total transcendence is logically, biologically, and ideologically impossible. Total determinism is self-defeating. The semi-transcendent way is the only way where you're able to half rise outside of yourself, make meaningful statements about reality, and measure them up against the truth as they really correspond. I will check this out against what Jesus taught and said as we progress along. But what we are told by the scientists is ultimately this, that we cannot get out from determinism, but they make positions of absolute statement all along, vitiating that principle as it begins, that they themselves are determined to say that. So I've penned this statement down. What the naturalist does is to claim total transcendence, an impossibility, while biologically driven to determinism, making a logically fatal move by attacking the only meaningful option of semi-transcendence and crucifying it with the psychological description of delusion. They look at you and me and tell us that we are ultimately deluded. So I want to move to this championing of their delusion cause and respond with the answers of Christ. The fact of the matter is this, that as we move and understand it, the term has taken on such coinage. Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion. Our friend Alistair McGrath from Oxford responded with the Dawkins Delusion. David Aikman wrote The Delusion of Disbelief, and David Berlinski, The Devil's Delusion. So the word delusion is floating around all over the place now, each one telling the other that he or she is completely deluded. I have present in the audience a psychologist who helped me get this from a book, The Essentials of Clinical Practice. Here's the definition they give of delusion, and I want to show to you at the end of it who is more deluded in their thinking. Delusions are the most extreme deviation in thought content. They are defined as fixed false beliefs that are maintained despite objective evidence and logical argument to the contrary. Furthermore, the belief is not one ordinarily shared by others who have similar educational or socio-cultural backgrounds. Let me repeat some words here. They are the most extreme deviation in thought. They are defined as fixed false beliefs that are maintained despite objective evidence and logical argument to the contrary. Furthermore, the belief is not one ordinarily shared by others who have similar educational or socio-cultural backgrounds. Now, they tell us that our belief in God is delusionary, that our faith in God is that one of a delusion. So let me start off with positioning two possibilities and then move to the argument for existence from God and ultimately show why it is the Christ who reveals to us that which is true, which is what the atheists are really resisting. Many, many years ago, when I was at university and doing my studies at graduate work, the biggest named atheist then was Anthony Flew. At that time, we had to read everything Anthony Flew had written. Now, of late, of course, Anthony Flew has disavowed his atheism and become a modified theist. He calls himself a deist. The irony of this is, had he changed his mind 30 years ago, it would have saved me an awful lot of reading, an awful lot of studies. Now, he is writing against Dawkins. He's telling us that Dawkins has not done his homework philosophically. But Anthony Flew, 40 years ago, wrote this. He would be embarrassed by it now, but this is what he said. Once upon a time, two explorers came upon a clearing in the jungle. In the clearing were growing many flowers and many weeds. One explorer says, some gardener must tend this plot. So they pitched their tents and set a watch. No gardener is ever seen. But perhaps, says somebody, there is an invisible gardener. So they set up a barbed wire fence. They electrify it. They patrol it with bloodhounds. For they remember about H.G. Wells and the Invisible Man. But no shrieks ever suggest that some intruder has received a shock. No movements of the wire ever betray an invisible climber. The bloodhounds never give cry. Yet still the believer is not convinced. But there is a gardener, I'm telling you, there is a gardener. He's invisible, intangible, insensible to electric shocks. A gardener who has no scent and makes no sound. But there is a gardener. This gardener comes secretly to look after the garden which he loves. At last the skeptic despairs. But what remains of your original assertion? How just does this what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener or even from no gardener at all? See what he's saying? There's the question. How does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener or even from no gardener at all? That was the question Flew posed 4 decades ago. John Frame, the philosopher, responded with this parable. Once upon a time, 2 explorers came upon a clearing in the jungle. A man was there pulling weeds, applying fertilizer, trimming branches. The man turned to the explorers and introduced himself as the royal gardener. One explorer shook his hand and exchanged pleasantries. The other ignored the gardener and turned away. There can be no gardener in this part of the jungle, he said. This must be some kind of trick. Someone is trying to discredit us from our previous findings. So they pitched camp. But every day this gardener arrives, tends the plot. Soon the plot is bursting with perfectly arranged blooms. He's only doing it because we are here to fool us into thinking there is a royal gardener. One day the gardener takes them to a royal palace, introduces the explorers to a score of officials who verify the gardener's status. Then the skeptic tries a last resort. Our senses are deceiving us. There is no gardener, no blooms, no palace, no officials. It's all a hoax. Finally, the believer despairs. But what remains of your original assertion? Just how does this mirage, as you call it, differ from a real gardener? Brilliant, isn't it? Absolutely brilliant. Now, what about the existence of God? See, these are the 2 points the atheists keep making. We can't devein them, but I want to at least tackle them in brief. The first argument that they make is that there's really no denotative proof for God. If Luigi made my pizza, I can point to Luigi and say, Luigi made my pizza. But if you say God made this world, point me to God. Show me God. And so Berlinski takes on Sam Harris. This is brilliant. Sam Harris argues that to believe that God exists is to believe that I stand in some relation to his existence, such that his existence itself is the reason for my belief. This sounds very much as if belief in God could only be justified if God were to call attention to himself, conspicuously waving a finger at us, say by dramatically waggling that finger or that hand. But if this is so, then by parity of reasoning, says Berlinski, one might argue that belief in neutrinos, that neutrinos have mass, is to believe that I stand in some relation to their mass, such that their mass is itself the reason for my belief. But how does a neutrino waggle its finger? A neutrino by itself cannot function as a reason for my belief. It is a subatomic particle, for heaven's sake. What I believe is a proposition of an abstract entity, that neutrinos have mass. How could a subatomic particle enter into a relationship with the object of my belief? But neither can a neutrino be the cause of my belief. I have, after all, never seen a neutrino. Not one of my neutrinos has ever gotten me to believe in it. The neutrino, together with almost everything else, lies at the end of an immense inferential trail, a complicated set of judgments. Hear what he said? It lies at the end of a trail of complicated sets of judgments. I believe what I do on the basis of the fundamental laws of physics and congeries of computational schemes, algorithms, specialized programming languages, techniques for numerical integration, huge canned programs, computer graphics, interpolation methods, nifty shortcuts, and the best efforts by mathematicians and physicists to convert the data of various experiments into coherent patterns, artfully revealing symmetries and continuous narratives. The neutrino has nothing to do with it. You know what he's saying? You're telling me you'll only believe in God in such a way if he actually waggles his finger at you. On that basis, I would never believe in a neutrino either. He says it takes all of science's research, all of the capacity of the mind, all of the data, all of the human experience. And so what I want to bring to you as I tie this together is, how do we come to this knowledge of God? And what is it that Jesus actually says about himself? Let me take you through 3 simple arguments, and they run like this. The first argument is this. If you take any physical quantity in this universe, any physical quantity in this universe and section it, you will end up with a problem. The problem is this: no matter how you section it, you will never find the reason for its existence in itself. The reason for everything physical, however sectioned, however spliced, will ultimately point to a cause outside of itself. That's the first stage of the argument. No matter how you section any physical quantity, you will always end up with a state of affairs where it does not explain its own existence.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. We're grateful for your prayers and financial support. If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at www.rzim.org. You can also stay connected to RZIM through Twitter and Facebook. Our mailing address is RZIM,